I hereby open this academic ceremony in which Victor Osei Kwadwo will defend the academic thesis called Inter-Municipal Cooperation and Environmental Outcomes, Impact, Drivers and Incentives. Mr. Kwadwo, may I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis?
Thank you. Dear Prorector, distinguished members of the coroner, supervisors, family and friends, thank you for the time and opportunity to present to you the summary of my thesis, which is titled Inter-Municipal Cooperation and Environmental Outcomes. Whenever we are faced with complex problems, what is usually recommended is cooperation, and more cooperation. Cooperation as a recommendation in public policy has become very normative. However, in as much as cooperation seems to be the solution to many of the world's problems, those who need it most are the ones who are less likely going to practice it. A case in point is how we hardly get our mayors, our local governments or municipalities, to work together to address issues that cut across boundaries. Amid rapid urbanization and its associated challenges, the cooperation challenge is not getting any easier. The motivation of this thesis is how to achieve intermunicipal cooperation in our cities to combat one of the critical urbanization challenges, and that is pollution. Cities are growing, so are the environmental footprint. Cities, mostly metropolitan areas, aside from hosting over 55% of the world's population and contributing to over 70% of the world's GDP, which is a good thing, they are also responsible for 60% of global energy consumption, 70% of global greenhouse gas emission, and 70% of global waste. Think of cities like Amsterdam, which has about 2.5 million people. We can also talk about Greater London with 40 million people. And also in Accra, we have the Accra metropolitan area, which has 3.5 million people. So the sheer sphere of influence of our cities make them the perfect scale for public policy interventions. However, one of the common things we find across our cities, think of Amsterdam, is that they have a lot of independent authorities, which is more or less fragmented. So Amsterdam has 32 independent authorities. In Greater London, we have 32 boroughs. And in Brussels, there are 19 independent mayors who are hardly always in agreement. When these areas have to address environmental problems that cut across boundaries, such as flooding or even air pollution, they face a collective action problem. This arises because environmental problems are intangible. They spill over boundaries, and one can easily free ride when you have to develop joint solutions. Hence, there's always the low incentive for cooperation when environmental outcomes are at stake. There is a need for cooperation to address issues that cut across boundaries. If we cast our minds back to the terror attack in Brussels in 2016, setting curfew times to deal with the situation was so ineffective as the municipalities could not work together to set a common time. The recent COVID situation and the lockdown regime is also a clear statement of why we need cooperation when issues cut across boundaries. We need cooperation, but achieving cooperation cannot be taken as a given. People work together not for the fun of it. A decision to work together with someone has underlying evaluation before a cooperation decision can be made. In the literature, it is established that cooperation leads to better economic and environmental outcomes. However, while the relationship between cooperation and economic outcomes is well established, that of environmental outcomes is understudied. So my thesis and presentation today is going to delve into the issues of intermunicipal cooperation and environmental outcomes in metropolitan areas. And it's going to address three key questions. One, the impact of cooperation. Two, the drivers of cooperation. And three, how to incentivize cooperation. The three research questions are independently addressed with a broader conceptual framework, which is based on polycentrism. And by polycentrism, what I mean is a situation where multiple local government areas, municipalities, or even jurisdictions are independent in decision-making. Due to the independence in decision-making attribute of polycentric arrangements, it poses a collective action problem when environmental issues that cut across boundaries are to be solved. So theoretically, based on this framework, we expect that when municipalities work together, they can achieve better environmental outcomes. but no study has comprehensively established this relationship yet. Also, empirically, we are aware that the factors that drive cooperation are known in the literature, but it is not clear what factors matters most as necessary and sufficient conditions. And lastly, if cooperation leads to better outcomes, as we expect in the research question 1, what can we do to incentivize it? So the chapter 2 of this thesis addresses the first component, where we establish the impact of cooperation on environmental outcomes. Studies show that cooperation saves costs, but can it also improve environmental outcomes? Existing empirical evidence actually establishes the relations between cooperation and environmental outcome. It's largely based on single case studies, and that does not actually help us to tease out the net effects of cooperation. In effect, there is a limited systematic, large-end studies that is testing the impact of cooperation on environmental outcomes. We therefore use a 3-level mixed effect linear model that accounts for both national and metropolitan factors to establish this effect, and we use a novel data set covering over 200 metropolitan areas in 16 OECD countries. We found that cooperation is crucial in reducing carbon transport emission, and this effect actually gets better when there are environmental mitigation policies which are set at the national level. So mitigation policies in itself did not actually impact environmental outcomes. However, having a policy in itself is not enough to address environmental outcomes. What turned out to be critical is the enforcement of the environmental mitigation measures, especially at the higher governance levels. So now that we know that cooperation is indeed a good thing to achieve better environmental outcomes, chapter 3 of this thesis brings out the most important factors that drives cooperation. Well, we have an idea of what drives cooperation. The literature identifies a significant number of factors, but what we do not know is that among all the factors, which ones are critical and which ones are not, which factors are necessary and which factors are sufficient. So inter-municipal cooperation studies are limited to single variable relations and net effect, which in reality, you would expect that the factors that drive cooperation will be more conjunctural and thus must not be viewed as isolated explanations. Also, there's a complete lack of comparative research on inter-municipal cooperation in the African context. So what we did was to undertake a comparative case study of African metropolitan areas. Specifically, we look at transport infrastructure provision in Greater Accra metropolitan area in Ghana, Greater Kumasi also in Ghana, and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. We then adopt a QCA, qualitative comparative analysis, which more than establishing net effects, allow us to test the necessary and sufficient conditions and whether these factors influence inter-municipal cooperation independently or concurrently. By necessary condition, what we mean is an overarching factor that has to be always present for cooperation to emerge. And by sufficient condition, what we mean is a factor whose presence may contribute to IMC or intermunicipal cooperation, but may not be the only factor. From the analysis, we found that there is no overarching factor that needs to be present for cooperation to emerge. However, financial incentives and political alignment were critical contributing factors to cooperation. This finding actually deviates from the growing literature on the role of networks in facilitating cooperation success, especially in the global north. And this tells us one thing: context matters if we really want to understand the drivers and how to facilitate cooperation. To this point, we know cooperation is important. We know what drives it. So the third chapter of this thesis explores how to incentivize cooperation to achieve the better outcomes that it promises. In the literature, 2 forms of benefits must align to actually come up with cooperation. These are joint benefits and then individual benefits. The only existing game theory model in the literature, specifically the intermunicipal cooperation literature, considers only the joint benefits and ignores the individual benefits. It also focuses on private and public goods, which are more or less divisible, unlike environmental outcomes. So this chapter of the thesis actually builds on the real game theory approach. It focuses on common goods and introduces the role of individual benefits that have to align with joint benefits to demonstrate the optimal strategy that we will need to incentivize intermunicipal cooperation. So what we did was to play a one-shot bargaining game for 2 differently motivated local governments. First is the city, which is most affected by a traffic congestion problem with rising carbon transport emission, whereas the second is peripheric, more rural, and less affected. So we came up with 3 scenarios, a prisoner's dilemma and 2 sequential games. And with that, we highlighted that, contrary to the expectation in the literature, even if the joint benefits from cooperation as valued by the actors do not exceed the sum of their status quo, cooperation can still emerge. And cooperation can emerge because if the right incentives are provided, it adds up to the value of the joint benefit and makes it more attractive than the status quo so that cooperation becomes an optimal choice. So in this thesis, we show in chapter 2 that cooperation leads to better environmental outcomes. That said, chapter 3 elaborates on the need to have a contextual understanding of the specific factors which are the most important drivers of cooperation. Because if eventually everything matters, then nothing matters. What chapter 4 did was to explore how these specific drivers can be used to incentivize cooperation. There are 3 contributions that emerge from this thesis. 1, while cities are unilaterally taking on the climate change mantle, for instance, New York and then Washington, D.C., they adopted the Paris Agreement when the USA government decided to exclude itself. The findings indicate that the impact of cooperation on carbon transport emission is better in metropolitan areas which have stringent environmental mitigation policies. So cooperation at a larger scale is critical for efficiency. It's not only about cities, but achieving this kind of cooperation at a larger scale. Therefore, though cities and metropolitan areas will provide us the perfect scale for public policy intervention, it is worthwhile for scholars, as well as practitioners, to continue to advocate a coupling of local thinking with global and national scales of action if we want to achieve a reduction in negative environmental outcomes. The second contribution is that we advance a methodological pathway to identify the necessary and sufficient factors that drive intermunicipal cooperation when outcomes are intangible. This thesis also compensates for the complete lack of comparative research on intermunicipal cooperation in the African continent to date. And we break the high prevalence of global North literature on our understanding of the drivers of intermunicipal cooperation. Specific to the African context, accounting for contextually defined incentives, such as finances and other political realities, is critical for intermunicipal cooperation success. To end, standard models and discourses addressing environmental dilemmas suggest a trade-off between individual and then collective social gains. This thesis promotes otherwise. Although it's not going to be easy, both personal and collective gains in ensuring cooperation around environmental challenges can be realized, and this must be pursued. The thesis sheds light on a win-win strategy that can be used to balance both individual and collective societal benefits to ensure cooperation emerges to address environmental challenges. To conclude, dear Prorector, distinguished members of the coroner, supervisors, I would like to end with a quote from Wen that summarizes the motivation and direction of this thesis. He states that cooperation is no longer reducible to rational behavior conception of process, but it is rather achieved through the socialization of actors and the construction of common interests and identities. I strongly believe that with the socialization of actors and the provision of the right incentives, we can achieve cooperation. I use the phrase strongly believe because from experience, with the right socialization and the right incentives, even the cheater would be happy to take a jolly walk with his spread. Thank you, and I give the word back to the Prorector.
Thank you for the introduction and oversight. And now we get to the defense of the thesis. The opposition will be started by Professor Cohen. Professor Cohen is the chairman of the assessment committee, and the assessment committee has before looked into the quality of the thesis and has decided to the fact that the thesis is ready for defense. And Professor Cohen is Professor of Economics of Technical Change at Maastricht University and Professor of Management at the Faculty of Economics and Management at the University of Strasbourg. Professor Cohen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, dear Victor, let me first congratulate you on having finished what I know has been a long and time-consuming piece of work. It's nicely done. It's very well read, very well written, and easy to read, and has expanded my horizons certainly. So as you know, it's not in the center of my core of my expertise. But let me ask you a couple of questions. The first one is a fairly general one, which I believe will come back over the next 45 minutes. And it has to do with your criteria of success for inter-municipal cooperation. And your success criterion seems to be, as you state explicitly, commitment. But I find this to be a very relaxed definition of success. Anyone who's been reading the newspaper at all has seen many commitments which have led to no action, coming out of not only municipal governments, but every level of government. So I'm a little bit curious about that. Later in the chapter, though, instead of talking about commitment, you talk about the importance of cost saving as a different criterion. So it sounds like the main goal of intermunicipal cooperation is cost saving, which suggests that the real measure of success shouldn't be commitment, it should be whether or not costs are saved. And this comes out quite specifically on page 86 in the version that I had, which I don't think is 86 in this one. The project itself did not succeed to date. The institutionalization of intermunicipal cooperation qualifies this case as a success. The project did not succeed, but the cooperation was a success. So this strikes me as a little tense, let's say. Now, you could argue that cooperation and technical success are two separate things, which I would buy. So you can have good cooperation, but poor technical processes. What's successful then? And why would we care about that kind of success? And if that's the case, how would you tell that the cooperation was good? So the short version of this is, why is commitment a reasonable definition of success?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the kind words and also for the question. We use cooperation success to mean the institutionalization to address a common problem. I agree with you that we could have gone beyond, establishing what we could define as success. But as you rightly said, the technical success is different from the cooperation success. And we actually focus on the aspect of the institutional success in terms of cooperation than the technical outcome of it. Because depending on the variables that you want to consider, what will go into technical success is more complicated in how you go into institutionalization. So our study is more focused on intermunicipal cooperation as a form of institutionalization. The theory behind this is that if there's a successful institutionalization, you would expect that it will lead to better outcomes. But there are studies that actually show that even with the right institutions, things at times go wrong, and then outcomes or project outcomes are not achieved. So we are very aware of that as well. That's why we try not to go into the project outcome itself, but rather stay on or focus on the institutionalization of arrangements that would be, or that is argued to be more effective in achieving cooperation. So that is the main reason why we focus on the success of cooperation defined as the institutionalization. In the case of Greater Accra in page 86, as you rightly quoted, they were successful in institutionalizing, but they were not successful in terms of the actual outcome that came out. There are quite a number of factors that affected or that explains why the actual outcome, which was the bus rapid transit, was not successful. But in terms of the institutionalization, they have GAPTE, which is the Greater Accra Transport. It's effective, it's established, it works. They did not establish the BRT in a way that is expected or that was projected, like what happened in Tanzania, but the institution is working now nonetheless. So I think it is important that we would at times, we should be able to link to the outcome. But for this particular thesis, we focus on the institutionalization of intermunicipal cooperation. I hope that answers the question.
Well, yes and no. You say that institutionalization works, it was a success, but it didn't produce the thing it was trying to produce. So in what sense does it work?
Exactly. Thank you once again. So again, back to the case of the Greater Accra, the evaluation of the project, the BRT, they had a version of it. So there are two different types of BRT, the one with dedicated lanes and then the one with marked lanes. The initial idea was in Greater Accra to have the ones with the dedicated lines that you have in Colombia and then in Dar es Salaam. So I would not consider that as a success because that was not the initial intention. It was a makeshift kind of outcome that was realized. So that was one reason why we stayed away from the outcome, because definition of a success of a project can be a bit, I think you need more to understand the success or failure of a project than the institutionalization aspect of it. So we stayed on the institutionalization aspect of it just to avoid the complexity in deciding whether Accra was successful or not. In some books, for instance, in the World Bank, they say it's a success. But when I'm there, in reality, this is not the kind of BRT that I would expect to happen in Accra.
Okay, I think some of my colleagues will follow up on this.
Now the opposition will be continued by Dr. Nime. She's associate professor in public policy at UNU Merit and Maastricht University.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, dear Victor, first I would like to congratulate you on a very insightful piece of work on a very relevant topic and at a very crucial time. I particularly appreciated how the multidisciplinarity of your research provided evidence that showed what the impact of cooperation can be, and that it could be a tool to indeed convince governments to become more proactive vis-a-vis cooperation. I think the mixed methods approach that you utilized, as well as the various contexts, was something that I truly enjoyed reading, and I would like to commend you on that and congratulate you. My question relates to your chapter 2, where you also included in your propositions that empirical evidence shows that intermunicipal cooperation saves cost, but does it also lead to better environmental outcomes? You said very clearly yes, and that local governments that work together on transportation issues in their metropolitan areas are able to reduce CO2 transport emissions. And here I go back to this discussion on processes. So I'm very curious to know, how is the process of metropolitan governance in particular and metropolitan governance cooperation is relevant in your findings? So this is something I have flagged out before. So for example, the process of initiating cooperation in a metropolitan structure, top down, bottom up, mixed of the both, is crucial to the success of the outcome and process in general. So understanding the place and importance of process gives much more insight on the various entry points for further cooperation and understanding truly how these mechanisms work. So I would like you to reflect and relate specifically on the items of impact drivers and incentives. How does that illuminate your findings and your research in general?
Earlier esteemed opponents, thank you very much for the kind words and then the compliment. Process is something that we actually made sure we followed up in the program, in the research. So there are different forms of institutional arrangements that can come up to address environmental outcomes and to talk to the issue of intermunicipal cooperation. If the metropolitan area is consolidated, for instance, into one spec, you wouldn't expect variation in how people work together because it will be top down. But what we focused on in this thesis is on fragmented metropolitan areas in systems where the municipalities are independent in making decisions. That takes away from a top-down approach to more of a bottom-up approach in intermunicipal cooperation. The challenge with the bottom-up approach is that even though it's argued to be effective with the idea of competitiveness, when municipalities are competitive, they work together, and then they're able to achieve some kind of economies of scale. In terms of the process in the fragmented areas, what is argued in the literature is that when people work together voluntarily, they are able to achieve better outcomes, in the sense that if the voluntary kind of agreement to work together with someone, you reduce the transaction cost. So the process in here is that with that level of cooperation, which is bottom up, which is voluntary, you kind of save costs in agreements and all those kind of technicalities in terms of having legal provisions to go ahead with a joint work. The voluntary approach in polycentric arrangements makes it easier in terms of the transactions costs that may come out of the cooperation agreement. So with that process, if transaction costs are low, then you're more likely going to achieve, or you're more likely going to go ahead with cooperation. And when transaction cost is high compared to the outcome you expect from cooperation, then you're not going to go for it. So the process, in a nutshell, I think was one of the key things that we looked at, and it's all about how to reduce transaction costs. I hope that addresses the question.
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you.
Opposition will be continued by Professor Bell. Professor Bell is the professor of the Department of Econometrics, Statistics, and Applied Economics at the Faculty of Business and Economics, University of Barcelona, and he is with us online. Professor Bell, floor is yours.
Thank you. Congratulations, Victor, for your dissertation. Though I had some question about the chapter 4, at this moment I will follow up on the issue about the success, not because I like discussing about nominal issues or names, but just to see whether it reflects a kind of an approach which I'm not sure is fully correct about cooperation. So it seems to be, from the explanation you gave to Professor Cohen, that cooperation unavoidably leads to better outcomes. So if you implement cooperation, then you will be successful. So implementing is success. And I think I cannot agree, because cooperation, which always need to be voluntary, if it's not voluntary, it's not cooperation. So trust is not a, I mean, whenever you place trust, this is subsumed in the fact that it's voluntary. Cooperation does not always lead to successful outcomes whenever implemented, as a matter of fact, so that the literature it's rich in diversity of results about outcomes, particularly about financial costs, which is the type of outcome most widely studied. So if cooperation, when implemented, does not always lead to success, you cannot say that implementing is success. You might say that implementation has been successful, which does not need to rely on outcomes. But you need to qualify what you refer to when you use success. Otherwise, you are evaluating the success of the tool without regard to the objectives, which I'm not sure this is a consistent way to analyze policies. The policies analyze not analyzing the tool, but analyzing the outcomes. So what's your, I mean, how about whenever you, I mean, I don't know at this moment whether the paper is being sent to journals or it's maybe accepted, I don't know. And if it's so, congratulations, no more point. But what about replacing success, generally speaking, with the implementation has been successful or successful implementation? By the way, I had this issue in an article I published 1 year ago, so one of mine. Of course, then nobody will have that type of concerns, on my view, and then it wouldn't seem that because your first your chapter 2, which is nice, I said it, because of your chapter 2 shows cooperation has good outcomes, it doesn't seem that you believe that always cooperation has good outcomes, because this is not consistent with what we know. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, highly esteemed opponent, for the kind words and also for the question. Kind of struggled a bit, through the question, but the key point that I heard from it is about how we use success or the issue of cooperation success. I totally agree with you that there is some kind of a thin line between looking at only the success of institutionalization and then the outcome in general. But the whole idea behind our formulation on institutionalization was that think of environmental outcomes. In terms of economic outcomes, you can actually put a value on it. So it's very easy, or it's easier to do a cost benefit analysis, and then mayors or decision makers can make a choice. Okay, this is not going to give me better returns, so I'm not going to cooperate. This will give me better returns, and I can cooperate. But with environmental outcomes, it's a bit different because the outcomes that we get from the environment is shared. So in the Netherlands, for instance, there's this fuel shopping, or I've forgotten the exact term, but people in Maastricht will drive all the way to Belgium to buy fuel because taxes on fuel there is cheaper, and then they come back to the Netherlands to drive. So if you have an environmental policy without cooperation across border with Belgium, at least the immediate border, whatever taxes you put on fuel in Netherlands, you're not going to achieve the expected outcomes that you can get for it. You would achieve some kind of benefit or better outcomes, but it wouldn't be as you may estimate if at least in Belgium you have similar tax regimes in there. So the idea of institutionalizing cooperation, I think, would be a good idea to look into its relationship with the actual outcome. Maybe an interaction with cooperation and then the success of the project would be a way to go, which I think we can explore in the future work. But it's also very important that institutionalization, based on the example that I just gave, is very important when it comes to environmental outcomes. That's why we stayed on it, to actually test the relationship, looking at the success of the institution mainly. I hope this clarifies the question a bit.
Can I one word? It clarifies to me that you are you have quite clear what you say, but then think about one question. If you intend to evaluate policy, you are not evaluating a rationalization, for instance, amalgamation, which could be a much better outcome policy without outcomes. So your answer would be quite good if the logic was cooperation and environmental issues, because they are spillovers, it's bounded to a successful. So something needs to be done. But then it might be much better to amalgamate. And you don't address this policy. By not amalgamating, they could be just foregoing benefits, even if they institutionalize cooperation. So again, I'm okay with this. We will follow with other questions. What is important is that you are kind of consistent with you say. But just an advice, I wouldn't place much evaluation on the tools rather than outcomes. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The position now will be continued by Dr. Nellis, also member of the assessment committee, and she is senior research fellow, Oxford Brookes Business School. Floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Victor. This is a really impressive piece of work, and congratulations on getting this far and all the work that you put into this at what was probably a very difficult time. There are lots of great things about it. I just want to call out, I think that the topic that you're talking about is really important. Climate change couldn't be more front and center. I think calling out the importance of metropolitan governance is important because, as we know, pollution doesn't respect jurisdictional boundaries. And there's lots of room for creativity and innovation at this scale, I think. So I'm right with you on that. And I think that there is indeed a need for comparative research on metropolitan areas in Africa. So I commend you on all of that. I think that this is an exciting thing to read that made me think about a lot of things. And I'm with my colleagues on having some reservations about the issue of how you define success and cooperation. I'm going to leave that because I think that'll come back again, but I wanted to focus on the sufficient conditions and kind of the implications of what you say about that. So this is sort of a multi-part question, so bear with me and hopefully you can classify these things in your head to come back to. But the first question I had was about the how you operationalized the availability of financial incentives and political alignment. I think the latter is a lot more difficult to determine, like how did you decide that people were politically aligned? So that and just overall in that chapter, I think operationalization was something where I was like, I'm curious how you made that decision that this was, but let's just focus on those sufficient conditions because they're most critical. The second bit of that question, which I think is a little bit more meaty, is that the things that emerge as sufficient in your analysis appear to be project related. That is, they're not a feature of the institutionalization itself, if I'm reading this right, but of the thing that they are trying to accomplish. So you might have a transportation body that exists, so therefore that's cooperation, right? You'd say that there's cooperation on a transportation issue. There's a general purpose transportation agency that's doing metropolitan transport, but they might have financial incentives or political alignment on a project related to building a road, but they might not have that in a different project. So thinking about bus transit or banning cars or pedestrian zones or something like that. And so how do you square that fact that you have cooperation that sort of exists as a feature that's enduring? It's an agency that exists with the fact that these projects have features that are different from that. And then does that limit the potential for this work to understanding the emergence of cooperation? Because really all that mattered was the emergence of that transportation organization or that's having these conversations, not the actual work that they're doing within it. And also just the fact that so I feel like there's a tension and a dissonance there between the sort of what might matter in the policy side versus what matters in the like creation of an entity that actually does that thing. Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponents, thank you very much for the compliment and then the question. So if I start from the last question, in terms of looking at this from the quality side, I totally agree that cooperation in itself may not necessarily lead to outcomes that are efficient or optimal, but nonetheless, cooperation leads to better outcomes depending on what you're looking at. And also, if you consider the projects in themselves, so for instance, the bus rapid transit in Tanzania, you look at the two factors that came out as sufficient conditions, which is the available financial incentives and then the political alignment. When it comes to financial incentives, for instance, the same financial incentive that was provided in Tanzania was provided in Accra and was provided in Greater Kumasi. So the idea behind this comparative analysis is that if you all have the same basis, why is someone failing and why is someone succeeding? And what came out was that looking at these factors independently doesn't really tell us the story. It doesn't give us an understanding of why these kind of, I would say, diversions occurred. So what we did with the QCA actually helped us to understand that in the case of the ISLR, there was more political alignment. And I'll explain what we mean by political alignment. So the political alignment was about how I would say the citizens, not technically defined, but how the people in the municipalities were able to push their government to at least go ahead with the implementation of the project. What the municipalities had to do wasn't providing the financial incentive that was already covered. It was about securing land. It was about the little things that the community as a municipality, they are not huge resource, so you wouldn't expect them to implement a BRT, but there were little things that they could do to secure the land. In the case of the ISLR, they did it effectively. In the case of Ghana, in Greater Kumasi, what happened was that when the project was kind of demarcated, then the land started getting value and areas allocated for the project was being sold at a point. So what happens is that when there's that level of non-cooperation, you are not likely going to achieve the better outcome that you can get if everybody works together. So mainly what we try to argue is that it's good to work together. I think in the previous question and even now, the project itself is also a key important thing that we may have to look at, but institutionalization is a step to the actual outcomes. That's why we focus on the institutionalization. In terms of our operationalization of the variables, what we did was a contingent evaluation approach to understand what were the drivers or what were pushing the key actors in the municipalities to cooperate. So with the idea from contingent evaluation is more of the hedonic pricing approach, where you try to come up with scenarios and try to understand from the perspective of the individuals or the actors, what drove them to make that decision. So first, when we established those 6 key factors, then we created scenarios where we'll be able to use those scenarios to test to what extent those factors affected the decision-making of the key actors in the area. So that's how we operationalize it, and that's how we're able to kind of come up with, okay, this municipality or this particular actor has trust as a key factor, but not necessarily maybe history. So these are the things that we considered. I also agree that when you look at cooperation, it can be assessed in a continuum. So there can be cooperation quality. It's not just a matter of we are working together, but if you work together, there's levels of quality in working together. I can decide to work together with you, but not necessarily be involved in that working together. So what we want to look at going forward is to have a continuum of cooperation and not measure cooperation as a yes and then a no. We can have a spectrum of it so that we can really tease out exactly what pushed the cooperation success in these areas. But given the time, and then also to avoid some form of complexity in being subjective in deciding what is cooperation or scoring cooperation, then we went for the one and no. Yes, and then the no. That was for the chapter 2. For the chapter 1, it was purely a data issue. So they are it's a lot difficult to get information or data on metropolitan areas or cities. So the best available data that we had were the binary cooperation, whether you're working together or you are not. So that influenced our choice of having cooperation measured in that way. But I totally agree that it would be, I wouldn't say ideal, but it would be interesting to have a look at cooperation in a broader spectrum. I hope this answers the questions.
Partly. I mean, I think you're, and I'm so sympathetic to this because as I've studied intermunicipal cooperation as well, like you grapple with where you draw the line, like what is it that you're trying to say? I think your issue is that because you've linked it to outcomes, instead of just saying, how does cooperation emerge? It gets a little bit trickier. And that's why we're kind of digging in on this, I think, a little bit more. And I guess as a sort of follow-up, again, just to push you to think about this a little bit, is like, if I've got this right, when you have if a metropolitan area has created a metropolitan transit authority or some sort of like environmental committee that then looks at transportation issues, then they've like checked the box. They're cooperating. Like that's all that matters really, as far as like your study is concerned, whether or not the projects that they do are successful or not. And I think that that's problematic on some levels in terms of the logic of putting that through. Finally, I think the other thing to keep in mind is that there's not always just one game in town. So in New York, where I am, there are multiple, what you could argue are metropolitan agencies. And in fact, I think depending on how you're defining that, which isn't super clear always, what the boundaries of a metropolitan region are, New York has either many or none, but they are competing with one another. Does that mean, I mean, the fact that there's more than one, does that mean that it's like super hyper cooperative? Or does that mean that you only pick one to look at as an instance of success? And sort of what's the implication of multiple different projects and multiple different types of institutionalization? So that's another puzzle, I think, for you. But we might need to move on. I'll leave it to the chair.
Thank you. Our session now will be continued by Dr. Arjan Schakel. He's researcher in the Department of Comparative Politics at the University of Bergen, Norway, and he is also with us online. The floor is yours.
Hello. Yes, thank you. Dear candidate, dear Victor, I would like to join in on the congratulations for your very well executed and very interesting PhD thesis. I've read it with great interest, and I'm particularly impressed with the methodological scope and rigor of your PhD research. And you move from a quantitative data set that you analyze with sophisticated multi-level models to qualitative interview data that you analyze using QSA, and on top of that, you also apply game theory. And in addition, the geographical scope of your empirical data is wide. It comprises both OECD and African countries. And especially your exploration on the drivers for inter-municipal cooperation within metropolitan areas in Africa is a very welcome and much needed contribution to the literature. And on top of that, your PhD is well written. The writing style is concise and efficient, yet also effective. So I've read your PhD thesis with great interest. My question concerns the order of the empirical chapter and how they inform each other. Yeah, so as clearly laid out in your presentation, you first start with an analysis on the impact of metropolitan governance structures on carbon dioxide emissions, which is followed by an exploration on the drivers for inter-municipal cooperation in African metropolitan areas. And the final empirical chapter presents the game theoretical analysis and the incentives for inter-municipal cooperation in case of intangible outcomes. And it made me wonder what your rationale was for this order of the empirical chapters. For example, an alternative order could have been to start with the game theoretical analysis, which would have enabled you to explore in how far these insights can be validated using your qualitative and interview data from African metropolitan areas. For example, you could have explored whether there is evidence that the core city is indeed risk-seeking and does indeed take initiative for collaboration, whereas the peripheral cities are more risk-averse and prefer to keep the status quo. Another thing that you could have explored in the qualitative data is the extent to which cost and benefits are perceived. And so you assume that the core city has more to gain, for example, a solution to traffic congestion, than peripheral cities. But peripheral cities also have to gain. Right? They can be more attractive, perhaps, for the individuals with good incomes, which then pay property taxes and live in the peripheral cities because there are good transport connections towards the core city. So I would like you to ask you to reflect on the extent to which your document and interview data provide empirical evidence for the assumptions and the findings of the game theoretical analysis.
Opponent, thank you very much for the kind words and for the question. You also had quite a discussion on how to arrange the empirical chapters, and the idea mainly was that before we actually go into the aspect of cooperation, we need to understand whether cooperation makes sense or we can get better outcomes from cooperation. If cooperation doesn't make sense, or if cooperation is not leading us to any better outcomes, then there's no point in going deeper to understand what cooperation means or what we need to have to drive cooperation. So the order of the empirical chapters was mainly based on first, we having a better understanding what cooperation offers. So the second chapter gave us that understanding that indeed cooperation leads to better environmental outcomes. Then the next one was okay, then what drives it? So knowing that it gives a better outcomes and also knowing the drivers was important. You had to explore that as the second option, because if we know specifically what drives cooperation, then our motivation to push the agenda of cooperation so that we can achieve a better economic environmental outcomes in our municipalities, we would have a good idea, a fair idea what we need to do. That's why we, in the second and the third chapter with the drivers, try to look at the sufficient and necessary, because what we found in the literature was that, there are a lot of factors that were talked about But the difficulty in all the literature, in most of the literature, was that you couldn't really pinpoint which one matters. So it was like, okay, a list of factors, everything matters. So what we try to do is, knowing that cooperation is important, to also figure out the most important factors contextually that we may need to look out if you want to pursue an agenda for cooperation. So the theoretical part, which is the game theory, I agree with you, it could have started, but I also believe that it's also best where it was, because at the point that we got to the theoretical part, we had a better appreciation that yes, cooperation gives a better outcome. And also we knew the factors that were driving cooperation. So in the formulation of the game, we were able to like, okay, if we increase this particular, if we introduce this particular incentive, then we can achieve this. So the order was mainly to have a better understanding first, a better understanding of the impact of cooperation, a better understanding of what drives it, so that we will know if we go into a community where we want to pursue cooperation, what can we do, or what specific factors should we look at? And that's the incentive approach that we use. I mean, incentives are always important, but if you're unable to identify the right incentive, then you fall in the trap of not being able to convince the person you want to work together with to achieve the outcome you want. So that was the rationale behind the order. I agree that it could have been the other way around, but based on the structure and based on the framework that we use, it looked the best alternative or the best option for us to go with. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, and I also asked a question about how the qualitative data informs the assumptions and the findings of the game theory analysis, and whether mention some of that qualitative evidence.
Thank you. So we treated the 3 papers independently. Even though we had learning from each paper, we had them as independent papers. So the theoretical aspect did not use the data from the second chapter where we looked at the drivers, but gives us the understanding of what may be needed to actually achieve cooperation. So in the literature, in the game theory, it was mainly on the joint benefits. But if you look at environmental outcomes, to get people to work together on the environment, it's not only about the greater good that we may get out of it. You have to go in deeper to understand the individual incentives in there. You don't have to believe in climate change before you start acting on it. If you identify the right incentives that everybody will need, or that at least will make people reach us halfway, we would be able to push the agenda, and then we would have individuals responding to climate mitigation measures, other than assuming that everybody, believes in the greater good and everybody's supposed to act climate sustainable. Everybody should supposed to be climate sustainable or climate friendly. I believe it doesn't work that way. We need to identify the individual incentives. And those individual incentives, depending on the context that you study, you would be able to, based on the necessary and sufficient conditions, know what will make them tick, and then use that as a basis to start a conversation or to start a cooperation agreement.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now the opposition will be continued by Professor Eleonora Nielsen. She's Professor of Public Policy and Development of Maastricht University. However, she is not with us today, but the question will be delivered by Professor Cohen.
Thank you. Dear Victor, Lonica sends her regrets and apologizes that she can't be here, but she has sent me some things to read, which I will now do. Dear candidate, while I understand that hierarchical models can be quite useful in settings that have a clustered structure, say schools, classrooms, pupils, I am really puzzled as to what kind of hierarchical structure you envision in chapter 2. You are interested in understanding whether IMC leads to lower CO2 emissions, with emissions measured at the metropolitan country level at time t. Why is your year variable your level 1 variable? It captures everything that happens in a given year in a given metropolitan area in a given country. How can this not be multicollinear with your other time varying variables at the metropolitan country level? And since year is such a black box, what do we learn from having this variable as a key independent? This brings me to my second question. Clearly, emissions and cooperations could be very endogenous, yet this is nowhere mentioned. Can you argue why, for example, macro policies or shocks could not both affect emissions and cooperation?
Can you take the second one again, please?
The second question is, could there not be a common cause for both emissions and cooperation? So a macro shock, for example, that reduces economic activity will reduce emissions, obviously. Might it not also reduce or possibly increase, we don't know, incentives or desire for cooperation? So you can imagine that if there's a macroeconomic crisis of some kind, people start running around trying to look for solutions and start cooperating with each other. That has nothing to do with these other things, for example.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the questions. So I'll start with the issue on the hierarchical model. If you look at environmental outcomes, we can argue that the municipality has a contribution to it, but you can also take away the fact that the nation within which the metropolitan area or the municipality belong does not have a say or does not have an effect on how the outcomes play. Let's think of instance, if you look at Sweden, it's more likely that municipalities or metropolitan areas in Sweden are going to be more environmentally friendly than when you look at municipalities in the USA. So our choice for the hierarchical model was to actually account for this national contribution as well as this metropolitan specific contribution that plays a role in driving the outcomes. But we focus on the outcome at the metropolitan level and integrated the kind of other factors that for instance, the national regulation can have an effect on the kind of how municipalities will act in that particular country. We have to also use the regional authority index, for instance, which captures how authority is shared within a particular metropolitan area. If you're in a country where there is not much autonomy in the local areas, then the level of influence that local authorities can have in driving environmental outcomes might be different. But if you're able to capture what the nation allows for every municipality to do, then at least we've been able to control for other external factors that may influence the outcome that we came with. So that is why we focus on the hierarchical model to make sure that at least we account for both the national and then the local factors that drives the environmental outcome, which was the carbon transformation that we looked at.
Let me interrupt you here because you're about to go on to the second question, I think. But the question was not why did you use the hierarchical model? The question says it's a good idea. The question was if you use year as your level one variable, don't you have a problem interpreting anything?
Yeah. We used year as a key variable in there because if you look at the environmental outcome, you realize the year within which you are measuring that particular outcomes explains more of the situation. So pollution is increasing, and depending on maybe the year that you're looking at, depending on maybe that year, what kind of policies that were introduced, it might have an effect on the kind of outcome that will be there. So we actually controlled for the specific year effect to make sure that the outcomes that we achieve are not like natural kind of outcomes. So a natural kind of decrease that we are recording, but rather a decrease which is based on the factors that we are looking at. So that's why we consider the year effect or the year variable specifically in that to make sure that the changes that occur are attributable to the variables that we are controlling for. The second question was on microshocks.
Well, it was on endogeneity.
Endogeneity. As much as possible, we try to make sure that we control for endogeneity. We use robust standard errors and everything, but there is a possibility, but I think I didn't see that coming up, especially for the model that we use. So I would say we are good on endogeneity, but I bet you if I did any other opinions on that, but I feel we did a good control. We tried different models. We ran with the hierarchical. Aside this, we also ran with CMP, and then we tried other variables, not only carbon transport emission, and we still got the same results. So I'm pretty confident that the results that we got they are very robust, and the issue of indigeneity, it can be an issue, but I think we still we're able to control for that and not, it shouldn't be a problem that much, I would say.
Opposition now will be closed by Dr. Nellis.
Thanks. I'm lucky I get a couple questions here. So I want to come sort of end with your sort of the implications of your overall arguments and take what you say in chapter 4 just a bit further. What kinds of exogenous benefits do you think are likely to be most powerful as incentives in structuring cooperation? And like that's a big question in and of itself, but I'm quite curious also as to who, in your opinion, is in a position, or what, in terms of organizations, to understand the web of personal and collective benefits and incentives that people face in making decisions to cooperate. And as a result, who can and should be designing these incentives to encourage intermunicipal cooperation. And to take that even a little bit further, are places that don't have actors who are willing to do that or who are able to at a disadvantage, just sort of definitionally, in terms of bringing those incentives together. And then does it all just come back to places that will be successful at this are going to be the ones with senior or upper levels of government who are willing to step in and create the incentives to make this cooperation happen? So it was a bunch of questions, but hopefully you got that.
Thank you. I'm afraid time is over now, but I would like to invite you for a short answer to the question, please.
Esteemed opponents, thank you very much for the question. So the idea of incentives as we perceive in this research is that it's very context specific. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of incentive recommendation that we're giving. What we're trying to promote is that every context have the kind of incentives that will work in that context. So it's important that depending on where you work in, figure out what is necessary, what is sufficient. And if you find what is sufficient, then you provide it. You are more likely going to achieve cooperation for a better outcome than if you go in with a blanket kind of incentive approach. What we did in our study was to find that we found that the financial incentive and political alignment was what worked. In our context, it's going to work. It doesn't mean it's going to work in another context. What we propose is that you can use the same methodological approach to understand what works in another country and then apply that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kwadwo. The time appointed for the defense of your thesis has passed. The committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. You and your company are requested to await the results in this room. Thank you.
Congratulations. This one's good. Walk around. Okay.
Mr. Kwadwo, the committee has reviewed your thesis and discussed it adequately, adequately of your defense. Because of its positive judgments, it has decided to award your doctorate to you. Dr. Skripka is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction according to the Dutch university habits. I will give floor to your supervisor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Victor Osei Kwadwo, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Dear Victor, it makes me very happy to see you stand here today as a proud new doctor of philosophy. I suppose it's a cliche to hear this on this spot in this great aula, but wasn't it a bit of a ride to arrive where you are today? I still remember you in your first year as a PhD fellow, when we just started discussing your fascination with metropolitan cooperation. In January of that first year, you had to present your first ideas in front of the Institute. And as many people in this audience know, this is meant as a brainstorming session. Before your presentation, you seemed quite nervous. So I emphasized that it would be okay to simply accept the comment without providing a response. And so you did for every single question. Fast forward 1.5 years, and what now is the second paper wins the Best Paper Award at the European Urban Research Association conference in Warsaw. What a leap. But not in knowledge, you were just as good at the start, but in confidence, your confidence in what you do and in your ability to freely share your enthusiasm for your topic. Fast forward another year, and we are in a convincing match discussing your next papers. It's not that you didn't listen to your supervisor, you did, but you stood firm on what you thought was right. And I had to use all my arguments and more, trying to move you inch by inch. I think only the arrival of Antonio as the promoter has rescued us from that non-ending conversation. But besides research, these years have been so much more. It was a pleasure to work with you on the courses in the regional integration and multi-level governance specialization. I knew that I could always rely on you through thick and thin, and you would always do excellent job, online or offline, from Maastricht or from Washington, even from your World Bank internship. Your student evaluations tell a lot about it too, all those glowing 9s. I'm grateful for this, and I'm hoping for more collaboration in the future. In fact, many people in this institute owe you a big thank you for stepping in, often at the last moment, picking up all sorts of difficult tasks and saving the day, time after time and again. I always thought that somebody should tell you about this exotic word, no, clearly unbeknown to you. But research projects or teaching, internship or supervision, you always did what you committed to with remarkable speed, efficiency, and your invariable smile and apparent ease. I still wonder how you do it. And what these years have also been is many friendships, football, the famous Ghana clan, cards, travel before COVID, and also family. What a joy it was when your wife, Oba, joined you, and then the happy arrival of your little son, Ivan. Victor, big congratulations and all the best to you in your bright future.
Dr. Kwadwo, let me congratulate you also on behalf of the Maastricht University board. Thank you for being with us, ladies and gentlemen, today. Thank you also for our members of the Corona who are with us online. Congratulations to promoter and co-promoter. I will now close this academic session and invite you all for a picture just outside this room on the stairs. Thank you.